Imagine standing at the edge of a beautiful meadow, where the golden light of the sun bathes everything in warmth and peace. In the distance, you see two men, one a young prince destined for a throne, and the other a humble shepherd. What begins as an unlikely friendship between these two souls grows into one of the greatest stories of loyalty and sacrifice ever told. This is the story of Jonathan, the prince who gave up his rightful claim to the throne for the sake of his friend David, and ultimately for the sake of God's greater plan. In this journey, we'll explore how Jonathan's life teaches us profound lessons about faith, humility, and true love. We'll walk with him through moments of decision, conflict, and courage, discovering how his trust in God allowed him to surrender his future and serve a higher purpose. Along the way, we'll see how Jonathan's bond with David became a reflection of God's covenant with us, selfless, loyal, and eternal. By the end of this story, we'll come to understand that true greatness is not found in power or position, but in love and sacrifice for others. Jonathan was born into privilege, the son of King Saul, the first king of Israel. From a young age, he witnessed the responsibilities and burdens of leadership, knowing that one day he too would wear the crown. As Saul's eldest son, Jonathan was the natural heir to the throne, a future king in waiting. His upbringing prepared him for greatness, teaching him the laws, traditions, and principles of ruling a nation chosen by God. But Jonathan's story would not follow the typical path of power. Even in his youth, Jonathan displayed a remarkable heart for God. Unlike his father, who often struggled with pride and insecurity, Jonathan trusted in the Lord's guidance. He had the strength of a warrior and the heart of a servant. This combination made him beloved by the people and respected by those who knew him. Jonathan was a leader in his own right, leading Israel's armies to victory and standing as a symbol of hope for the future of the kingdom. Despite his many accomplishments, Jonathan's greatest strength was not found in his position or power, but in his humility. He understood that his role in life was not to seek glory or riches for himself. As he grew older, Jonathan realized that the throne might not be part of God's plan for him, but this did not diminish his sense of purpose. Instead, he remained faithful to God's unfolding will, willing to serve however he was needed. Jonathan's journey took a surprising turn when David, a humble shepherd, entered his life. The friendship that blossomed between Jonathan and David was unexpected yet profound. Jonathan recognized something special in David, an anointing from God. Where others might have seen a threat, Jonathan saw a friend and a future king, one whom he would support with unwavering loyalty. In a world where power often leads to jealousy and rivalry, Jonathan's acceptance of David's calling was revolutionary. He could have clung to his birthright, fought for the crown, or viewed David as competition. But Jonathan knew that God's plan was far greater than his own ambitions. His trust in God's wisdom allowed him to see past the allure of the throne and into the heart of God's chosen leader. Jonathan's life is a reminder that true greatness is not found in titles or thrones, but in our willingness to trust God's purpose for our lives. His story sets the stage for the powerful bond he would share with David, a bond rooted in faith and a shared commitment to follow God's will. Without the burden of ambition weighing him down, Jonathan was free to embrace a life of love, loyalty, and ultimate sacrifice. The meeting between Jonathan and David was no ordinary encounter. It was a moment orchestrated by God, one that would forever change both of their lives. Jonathan, the Prince of Israel, and David, a young shepherd boy, were worlds apart in terms of status and background. Yet when they met, there was an instant connection, a deep bond that transcended social class, wealth, and ambition. The Bible tells us that Jonathan's soul was knit to David's, and from that day forward, they became the closest of friends. Jonathan saw in David not just a warrior or a potential rival for the throne, but a man after God's own heart. David's faith and courage resonated with Jonathan, whose own trust in God was steadfast. This bond was more than mere companionship. It was a divine friendship. Jonathan wasn't just drawn to David's strength or his success in battle. He saw the anointing of God upon David's life, and he recognized that God had chosen David for something far greater than either of them could imagine. As their friendship grew, Jonathan did something remarkable. He gave David his royal robe, armor, sword, bow, and belt, a symbolic act that signified his willingness to lay down his own future as king. In doing so, Jonathan acknowledged David as God's chosen leader. For Jonathan, this wasn't a sacrifice born out of weakness or fear. It was an act of faith, trust, and profound love. He didn't see his friendship with David as a threat to his own destiny, but as a part of God's larger plan for Israel. In today's world, where personal ambition often takes precedence over relationships, Jonathan's actions stand as a powerful testament to selflessness and loyalty. He could have allowed jealousy or competition to drive a wedge between him and David, but instead, he chose to love David as his own soul, demonstrating a rare kind of friendship, one that put God's will above his own desires. This bond between Jonathan and David wasn't just about personal loyalty. It reflected their shared faith in God. Both men trusted in God's sovereignty, and they were willing to sacrifice their own ambitions to see his plan fulfilled. For Jonathan, this meant giving up his rightful place as king. For David, it meant relying on God to establish him as the leader of Israel in his own time. Jonathan's friendship with David teaches us that true love and loyalty come from a heart surrendered to God. When we put aside our own interests and trust in his greater plan, we find the kind of friendship that stands the test of time. Jonathan and David's relationship wasn't built on convenience or personal gain. It was grounded in their shared commitment to follow God's will, no matter the cost. This divine bond between Jonathan and David serves as a reminder that God often brings people into our lives for purposes we may not immediately understand. But when we open our hearts to those divine connections, we can experience relationships that reflect the depth of God's love and his perfect timing. Jonathan's bond with David wasn't about what he could gain, but about what he could give, his loyalty, his trust, and ultimately, his future. Jonathan's decision to surrender his claim to the throne was a moment of profound faith and selflessness. As Saul's eldest son, Jonathan was next in line to rule Israel, and no one would have questioned his right to the crown. But Jonathan was not driven by ambition or the desire for power. Instead, he recognized the hand of God on David's life and willingly stepped aside, allowing David to rise as Israel's future king. In a world where power and prestige are often clung to tightly, Jonathan's act of surrender stands as a powerful testament to his character and faith. This decision didn't come easily. Jonathan was well aware of the sacrifices he was making, giving up not only his future as king, but also the expectations that came with being Saul's son. The pressure from those around him, especially from his father, must have been immense. Yet Jonathan didn't waver. He understood that God's plan was greater than his own desires, and he trusted that stepping aside was part of God's purpose. His love for David, and more importantly, his love for God, guided his choice. What makes Jonathan's act so remarkable is that it was entirely voluntary. No one forced him to give up the throne. He did so out of the purity of his heart. This kind of selflessness is rare, especially when it comes to matters of power and leadership. Jonathan wasn't concerned with what he stood to lose, but with what God's kingdom would gain through David's leadership. His faith allowed him to see beyond his personal loss and focus on the greater good for Israel. As Jonathan removed his royal robe and gave it to David, along with his armor and weapons, he symbolized more than just the transfer of power. He was acknowledging that God had chosen David to lead Israel, and he fully embraced that calling. This act was not just a sign of friendship, but of deep spiritual insight. Jonathan knew that the throne wasn't meant for him, and rather than resist, he surrendered with grace and humility. For many of us, surrendering control can be one of the hardest things to do. We often hold tightly to our plans, our dreams, and our desires, even when God may be calling us to something different. Jonathan's story challenges us to examine our own hearts and ask, what is God asking me to surrender? Are we willing to trust His plan, even when it means giving up something we hold dear? If this message has touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Has there been a time in your life when you've had to surrender something to God's greater plan? If you'd like, simply comment "trust" to let us know you are walking this journey of faith with us. Jonathan's decision to give up the throne for David teaches us that surrender is not about defeat, but about trusting in a purpose greater than our own. It's about laying down our own ambitions to allow God's will to unfold. And as Jonathan's story shows us, there is great peace and blessing in surrendering to His plan. The friendship between Jonathan and David went beyond ordinary companionship. It was a covenant sealed by their faith in God and their loyalty to one another. In ancient Israel, covenants were sacred agreements, often made before God as witnesses. When Jonathan and David entered into their covenant, it was more than a simple promise of friendship. It was a deep, spiritual bond that bound them together in purpose and faith. Jonathan's unwavering commitment to David was a reflection of his own trust in God's divine will for Israel. This covenant wasn't formed out of convenience or personal gain. Jonathan had nothing to gain by aligning himself with David, a man who was, in many ways, a threat to his future. Yet, their bond was rooted in something far more profound, a shared belief in God's plan. Jonathan's covenant with David was a declaration that he would protect and support David, no matter what challenges lay ahead. It was a bond that transcended family loyalties and political pressure, standing firm even in the face of King Saul's opposition. The covenant was marked by a profound sense of trust and vulnerability. Jonathan and David opened their hearts to one another, sharing not only their hopes and dreams, but also their fears and uncertainties. In a world where many friendships are based on surface-level connections, Jonathan and David's relationship was built on transparency and mutual respect. They weren't afraid to be honest with each other, and that honesty strengthened their bond. Jonathan's willingness to stand by David, even when it meant defying his own father, is a powerful testament to the strength of their covenant. Saul's jealousy of David put both men in danger, but Jonathan remained steadfast. He wasn't swayed by his father's anger or threats. Instead, he acted as a mediator, trying to protect David while honoring his father as best he could. This delicate balance reveals Jonathan's deep sense of responsibility and faith, as he trusted that God would guide him through the most difficult circumstances. Their covenant wasn't just about loyalty in the present, it was also about securing the future. Jonathan made David swear that when David became king, he would show kindness to Jonathan's descendants. This part of the covenant demonstrated Jonathan's selflessness once again. Even though he knew David would ascend to the throne, Jonathan's priority was ensuring the well-being of his family, reflecting his long-term vision and love for those he cared about. Jonathan and David's covenant challenges us to think about the relationships we form in our own lives. Are they rooted in faith, trust, and a commitment to something greater than ourselves? Their bond teaches us that true friendship requires sacrifice, vulnerability, and a willingness to stand by one another, even when it costs us something. It's a reminder that the strongest relationships are built not on what we can get, but on what we are willing to give. Jonathan found himself in one of the most difficult situations imaginable, torn between his loyalty to his father, King Saul, and his unwavering commitment to his friend, David. Saul's jealousy and paranoia toward David were growing by the day. The king saw David as a threat to his rule, and his anger soon turned into open hostility. Saul's orders were clear: David must be killed. But Jonathan, who knew David's heart and God's plan for him, could not betray his friend. In this moment, Jonathan faced a choice that would test the depth of his faith and loyalty. Standing by David meant defying his father, the king of Israel. This wasn't just an act of personal rebellion, it was an act of faith. Jonathan understood the seriousness of his decision, and it was one that could have cost him everything: his father's favor, his position, and even his life. Yet Jonathan knew that protecting David was the right thing to do. He couldn't let his father's jealousy destroy the man whom God had chosen to lead Israel. His love for David and trust in God's will were stronger than his fear of his father's wrath. Jonathan didn't act recklessly or out of bitterness. Even in his defiance, he sought to honor his father as much as possible. He tried reasoning with Saul, reminding him of David's loyalty and the good he had done for Israel. Jonathan hoped that by appealing to his father's sense of justice, he could save both David and his relationship with Saul. Unfortunately, Saul's jealousy had clouded his judgment, and he refused to listen to reason. Jonathan's attempt to mediate failed, but it showed his heart, one that desired peace and reconciliation, even in the face of impossible circumstances. This conflict between Jonathan and Saul highlights the complexities of loyalty and obedience. Jonathan was not just defying a father, he was going against the king of Israel. Yet his loyalty to David was rooted in something greater than family ties or political allegiance. It was grounded in his obedience to God. Jonathan understood that sometimes following God's will means standing up against those we love, even when it is painful. His actions remind us that true loyalty isn't about blind obedience, but about doing what is right in God's eyes. The tension between Jonathan's love for his father and his commitment to David is something many of us can relate to in our own lives. We may find ourselves in situations where loyalty to one person seems to conflict with our loyalty to God. Jonathan's story encourages us to choose faithfulness to God's purpose, even when it's difficult. His courage to stand by David despite the cost is a powerful example of what it means to be guided by faith, not fear. In the end, Jonathan's defiance of Saul wasn't about rebellion, it was about choosing God's plan over human expectations. Jonathan knew that his father's anger would never be enough to stop what God had ordained. And so he stood firm in his commitment to protect David, even if it meant going against his own family. His loyalty to David wasn't just about friendship, it was about trusting in God's greater plan for Israel and being willing to sacrifice for it. Loyalty is often tested in the hardest of times, and Jonathan's loyalty to David was no exception. As tension escalated between King Saul and David, Jonathan found himself caught in the middle of a dangerous conflict. It would have been easy for Jonathan to take the safer path, to align himself with his father and ensure his own future on the throne. Yet Jonathan chose to remain loyal to David, even though it put him at odds with his father and the entire royal court. His loyalty was not based on convenience or self-preservation, but on his deep love for David and his trust in God's will. Jonathan's loyalty to David wasn't passive, it was active and sacrificial. He didn't just speak words of support, he risked his life to protect David. Time after time, Jonathan warned David of Saul's schemes and helped him escape from danger. These actions came at great personal cost. Jonathan knew that by standing with David, he was losing the favor of his father and potentially forfeiting his own claim to the throne. But Jonathan's loyalty to David wasn't about securing his own future. It was about securing God's plan for Israel. In moments of conflict, loyalty often requires sacrifice. Jonathan's loyalty to David meant walking away from the privileges of being a prince and embracing the uncertainty of the future. It required him to put his trust in God, knowing that his own path was no longer clear. Jonathan didn't cling to his title or position. Instead, he chose to serve David, recognizing that his true role was to support the man whom God had chosen to lead. This kind of loyalty is rare because it goes against the grain of human nature, which often seeks self-preservation above all else. Jonathan's loyalty was not just to David as a person, but to the greater purpose that God had revealed. He wasn't blinded by personal ambition or family loyalty. He saw the bigger picture. Jonathan understood that God's plan was more important than his own desires or even his relationship with his father. This kind of loyalty requires a deep faith, a willingness to surrender personal ambition for the sake of something greater. Jonathan's example challenges us to consider where our loyalties lie and whether we are willing to make sacrifices for the sake of God's kingdom. At times, loyalty can feel lonely. Jonathan stood in a difficult position, knowing that his father saw him as a traitor and that many in the court likely questioned his allegiance. But Jonathan was not swayed by public opinion or the pressures around him. His loyalty to David was grounded in his loyalty to God, and that gave him the strength to stand firm even when others misunderstood his choices. Jonathan's loyalty teaches us that standing by someone in times of conflict often means standing alone, but it also means standing in God's will. In a world where loyalties often shift with convenience or personal gain, Jonathan's steadfastness is a reminder of what true loyalty looks like. It's not about what we can gain from the relationship, but about what we are willing to give. Jonathan's loyalty to David was a reflection of his loyalty to God's greater plan, and it shows us that true loyalty is ultimately about faithfulness to God, even in the midst of conflict. In the face of immense pressure and uncertainty, Jonathan's faith remained unshaken, while others, including his father Saul, were driven by fear of losing power, fear of the unknown. Jonathan placed his trust in God's plan. His confidence wasn't based on the circumstances around him, which often seemed dire, but on his belief that God was in control. Jonathan knew that his role in the unfolding of Israel's history might not be what he originally expected, but he trusted that God's purposes were always perfect. Jonathan's ability to place faith over fear is a remarkable aspect of his character. Despite the fact that his father was the king and that by all rights Jonathan should have inherited the throne, he was not anxious about what the future held. He didn't allow fear of losing his position or status to dominate his heart. Instead, Jonathan surrendered his future to God's will, knowing that whatever happened, God's plan would be for the good of Israel and for the glory of his kingdom. While Saul allowed fear and jealousy to consume him, leading to destructive actions, Jonathan chose a different path. His faith kept him grounded, even when his loyalty to David put him in danger. Jonathan could have easily given in to the fear that surrounded him. The fear of his father's wrath, the fear of losing everything he had worked for, the fear of uncertainty. But Jonathan's trust in God allowed him to rise above those fears. He didn't cling to his own desires or control. He rested in the knowledge that God was guiding his steps. Jonathan's faith is a powerful reminder that fear can distort our perspective, making us act out of desperation or insecurity. But when we place our faith in God, we can face even the most difficult situations with peace and confidence. Jonathan's story challenges us to examine the areas of our lives where fear might be holding us back from fully trusting in God's plan. Are we afraid of losing control, status, or comfort? Jonathan's example teaches us that faith requires letting go of our fears and trusting that God's plans are better than our own. Throughout his journey, Jonathan showed that faith doesn't always lead to the outcomes we expect, but it always leads us to God's purpose. He didn't know how things would unfold for him or for David, but he trusted that God's plan was perfect. Jonathan's willingness to surrender his claim to the throne and embrace his role in supporting David was a reflection of his deep faith. He knew that his life was not about his own glory, but about serving God's greater plan for Israel. In our own lives, we may not always understand why things happen the way they do, but Jonathan's story encourages us to trust that God is at work, even in the midst of uncertainty. Faith over fear means believing that God's plan is unfolding in ways we may not yet see, and that His purposes are always for our good and His glory. Jonathan's confidence in God's plan, even when it meant giving up his own future as king, is a testament to the strength that comes from trusting in God over our own fears. Jonathan's life left behind a legacy that was built on love, sacrifice, and unwavering faith in God. Though he never sat on the throne of Israel, his impact was far greater than any royal title could have granted him. Jonathan's legacy wasn't written in the history books for conquering lands or expanding kingdoms, but in the hearts of those who knew him, especially David. His life serves as a powerful reminder that true greatness is not found in the pursuit of power, but in our willingness to serve others and put God's will above our own. Jonathan's legacy of love was most clearly seen in his friendship with David. He loved David as his own soul, and that love was sacrificial. Jonathan's willingness to give up his future for David's success wasn't just a political move. It was an act of deep, selfless love. In a world where ambition often drives people apart, Jonathan's bond with David shows that love can overcome even the strongest of rivalries. Jonathan's love for David wasn't about what he could gain, but about supporting God's chosen leader, no matter the personal cost. Sacrifice was at the core of Jonathan's character. He sacrificed his position, his title, and even his safety to ensure that David would survive and thrive. This kind of sacrifice is rare, especially when it involves giving up something as significant as a throne. Jonathan's life teaches us that true love always involves sacrifice, whether it's sacrificing our time, our resources, or even our own dreams for the sake of others. Jonathan didn't view his sacrifices as losses, but as part of God's plan for the greater good. Jonathan's legacy of faithfulness extends beyond his friendship with David. It is also reflected in his unwavering commitment to his father, King Saul, despite the king's deteriorating mental state and growing paranoia. Jonathan never abandoned Saul, even when his father's actions became erratic and dangerous. Jonathan's love for his father was patient and enduring, even as he sought to protect David from Saul's wrath. This balancing act of loyalty between his father and his friend demonstrates the depth of Jonathan's character and his commitment to doing what was right in God's eyes. In many ways, Jonathan's legacy lives on through David, who never forgot the sacrifices Jonathan made for him. Even after Jonathan's death, David honored their covenant by showing kindness to Jonathan's descendants, particularly Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son. David's care for Mephibosheth was a direct reflection of the love and loyalty Jonathan had shown him. Through David's actions, Jonathan's legacy of love and sacrifice continued to bless future generations. Jonathan's life reminds us that our legacy isn't defined by titles or earthly achievements, but by the love and sacrifices we make in obedience to God. His story challenges us to think about the legacy we are building through our relationships and our choices. Are we living in a way that reflects love and sacrifice for others, or are we focused on our own ambitions? Jonathan's life encourages us to live with a heart surrendered to God, trusting that the sacrifices we make in faith will leave a lasting impact, even if we don't see the results in our lifetime. Jonathan's life, though marked by loyalty and love, ended tragically on the battlefield. As a warrior and a prince, Jonathan was no stranger to conflict. He had fought valiantly for Israel alongside his father, King Saul, and had seen many victories. But in the end, Jonathan's loyalty to his father led him into a battle he could not win. Alongside Saul and his brothers, Jonathan fell in the fierce battle against the Philistines on Mount Gilboa. His death was a heartbreaking moment, not only for his family, but for all of Israel. Even in his final moments, Jonathan's courage never wavered. He fought with the same bravery and honor that had defined his life. Jonathan knew the risks of going into battle with his father, especially as Saul's mental state deteriorated and his leadership faltered. But Jonathan's loyalty to his father remained steadfast. He stood by Saul's side until the very end, not out of duty alone, but out of love. Jonathan's heart as a warrior was tied to his heart as a son, and he could not abandon his father, even in the face of certain defeat. The tragedy of Jonathan's death lies in the potential that was lost. He was a man of great promise, strong, faithful, and wise. His life could have continued to serve Israel in countless ways, perhaps even as an advisor or a general in David's future reign. Yet Jonathan's life was cut short, and with it, the possibility of seeing how his relationship with David and his role in God's plan for Israel might have further unfolded. It is a reminder that sometimes those who are most faithful and selfless do not always live to see the full fruit of their sacrifices. David's reaction to Jonathan's death reflects the deep bond they shared. When David learned of Jonathan's death, he was overwhelmed with grief. His lament for Jonathan, recorded in the Bible, is one of the most poignant expressions of love and loss. "I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women." David's sorrow reveals the depth of his friendship with Jonathan and the profound sense of loss he felt at Jonathan's passing. Jonathan's tragic end also highlights the cost of loyalty. His death on the battlefield was the ultimate sacrifice, not just for Israel but for his father. Jonathan's loyalty to Saul, despite the king's flaws, speaks to his unwavering commitment to family and duty. While others might have abandoned Saul as his reign crumbled, Jonathan remained with him until the very end. His faithfulness to his father, even in death, reveals a heart that understood the true meaning of honor and love. Though Jonathan's life ended in tragedy, his legacy of loyalty, sacrifice, and faith continues to inspire. His story reminds us that even in the face of loss, our lives can leave a lasting impact when we choose to live with love and faithfulness. Jonathan's warrior heart was not defined by the battles he fought, but by the love and loyalty he showed, both to his father and to his friend, David. His tragic end does not diminish the beauty of his life. It magnifies it, reminding us that true greatness is found in how we love and serve, even unto death. Jonathan's life offers timeless lessons that continue to resonate today. His bond with David, his faith in God, and his unwavering loyalty to both friend and family teach us powerful truths about love, sacrifice, and purpose. Though Jonathan did not live to see the full unfolding of God's plan for Israel, the impact of his life is eternal. His friendship with David wasn't just a bond between two men. It was a reflection of God's love for us, selfless, loyal, and unconditional. The story of Jonathan and David is often seen as one of the greatest examples of friendship in the Bible, and rightly so. But it is also a story about trust in God's plan, even when that plan doesn't align with our own hopes and desires. Jonathan could have clung to his position as heir to the throne, but instead he surrendered it, recognizing that God had chosen David for that role. Jonathan's willingness to step aside for the sake of God's will is a lesson in humility and faith, showing us that sometimes true greatness is found in letting go. Jonathan's life also teaches us about the power of covenant relationships. His bond with David wasn't just about friendship. It was a sacred promise to support and protect one another, no matter the cost. In a world where relationships are often transactional, Jonathan's example challenges us to form deeper, more meaningful connections based on love and faithfulness. His covenant with David shows us that true friendship is about giving, not receiving, and about walking together through both joy and suffering. Another powerful lesson from Jonathan's life is the importance of standing firm in our faith, even in times of conflict. Jonathan faced immense pressure from his father, King Saul, who demanded loyalty at all costs. Yet, Jonathan knew that his higher loyalty was to God's will. He wasn't afraid to stand up for what was right, even when it put him at odds with his father and the expectations of the kingdom. Jonathan's courage to choose faith over fear reminds us that following God's path often requires difficult decisions, but those decisions are always rewarded with peace and purpose. Perhaps the most enduring lesson from Jonathan's life is that love and sacrifice go hand in hand. Jonathan's love for David led him to sacrifice his future, his safety, and ultimately his life. This kind of sacrificial love reflects the love of Christ, who gave his life for us. Jonathan's story points us to a deeper understanding of love, not as a fleeting emotion, but as a commitment to put others before ourselves, trusting that God's plan will always lead to greater good. As we reflect on Jonathan's life, we are reminded that our own lives are part of a larger story, God's story. Like Jonathan, we may not always see the full picture or understand why things happen the way they do, but we can trust that God's plan is perfect. Jonathan's legacy of love, faith, and sacrifice invites us to live with the same confidence, knowing that when we follow God's will, we leave behind an eternal bond that continues to impact others, even long after we are gone. As we reflect on Jonathan's life, we're reminded of the power of faith, love, and loyalty. Jonathan's willingness to step aside for David, his courage to stand firm in the face of conflict, and his deep trust in God's plan offer us timeless lessons. His story challenges us to look at our own lives and ask, where is God calling me to surrender my plans for His? And how can I show the kind of selfless love that Jonathan showed to David? Jonathan's legacy lives on, not because of the throne he could have claimed, but because of the eternal bond he shared with David and the sacrifices he made for God's kingdom. His life invites us to trust God's plan, even when it requires sacrifice, and to build relationships based on love, loyalty, and faithfulness. May we walk in Jonathan's footsteps, living with courage, humility, and a heart surrendered to God's will. Let us close in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for the example of Jonathan's life, a life of loyalty, love, and faith in your greater plan. Help us to follow his example, to trust in your will even when it requires sacrifice, and to love others selflessly as you have loved us. Guide us in building relationships that reflect your love and your faithfulness, and give us the courage to stand firm in our faith, no matter the challenges we face. In Jesus' name, amen. If this message touched your heart, please consider sharing it with friends and family who might need encouragement today. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to receive more inspiring content that deepens your walk with God.